The doors of the great hall opened with a sound like thunder, and Alira Voss felt every eye in the room turn toward her at once. She had not asked to be here. She had not wanted the silver dress they forced onto her body, or the crown of white flowers pinned into her hair. She wanted to run. But guards stood on both sides of her, and behind her, more guards blocked the only way out. There was nowhere to go except forward, toward the throne where the Alpha King waited. Alira kept her chin low, and her hands folded in front of her, the way her mother had taught her since she was a child. Do not draw attention, do not stand out. Blend into the crowd like smoke, and no one will ever see you clearly enough to remember your face. It had worked for 21 years. It stopped working the moment her name was called from the list of unmated Omegas required to attend the presentation. The hall was enormous, built from pale stone that seemed to glow under 100 burning torches. Banners hung from the high ceiling, each one marked with the crest of the Thorn bloodline, a wolf circled by a ring of silver stars. Nobles from every pack in the kingdom filled the long rows of seats, whispering behind gloved hands, as the Omegas were led forward one by one. Alira counted the other girls around her, 12 in total. Some looked eager, hopeful even, dreaming of being chosen by the king and lifted into a life of luxury. Alira felt only dread pressing against her ribs like a fist. She did not want to be chosen. She could not be chosen. Not with what was waiting for her at home. Not with what she was hiding in her blood. At the front of the hall, on a throne carved from black wood and lined with silver, sat King Cassian Thorn. Alira had heard stories about him her whole life, the way children hear stories about storms they have never seen. They said his eyes could freeze a man in place from across a battlefield. They said he had never lost a fight, never broken a promise, never once shown mercy to an enemy of his throne. She had expected a monster. What she saw instead was a man with dark hair falling loosely over his forehead, broad shoulders wrapped in a black coat, and an expression so still it looked carved from stone. He was not looking at the hall. He was not looking at the nobles or the banners or the 12 girls lined up before him. He was staring directly at her. Alira's breath caught somewhere behind her chest. It was not the polite, assessing glance a king might give to a room full of candidates. It was recognition. Raw, sudden, absolute recognition, as though he had been waiting his whole life for the exact moment her eyes met his. The hall around her seemed to dim. She could hear her own heartbeat, too loud, too fast, hammering against her ears. He rose from the throne. A murmur swept through the crowd. Kings did not rise for the presentation. Kings sat and watched, and pointed a single finger when they had made their choice. But Cassian Thorn stood, and he walked down the long stone steps toward the line of girls, his boots striking the floor with slow, deliberate weight, and every step he took was aimed directly at her. Alira's mind raced through every possible explanation, and found none of them comforting. Perhaps he recognized her scent from something in her blood he should not be able to detect. Perhaps someone had already told him about her mother, about the sickness that ran quietly and dangerously through her family line, about the truth Alira had spent her entire life burying so deep that even she sometimes forgot it was there. He stopped in front of her. Up close, he was even taller than she expected, and his eyes were not cold at all. They were a deep, storm-colored gray, and they moved over her face, like he was trying to memorize something he was terrified of losing again. "It's you," he said quietly, so quietly that only she could hear it. Alira's throat tightened. "Your Majesty, I don't understand." 3 years, he said, and something in his voice cracked, just slightly, just enough for her to hear the weight behind the words. 3 years, and I finally found you." The hall had gone completely silent. Every noble, every guard, every one of the other 11 Omegas stood frozen, watching a king who had never shown weakness in his life stand before an unknown healer's daughter, with something dangerously close to desperation written across his face. Alira felt panic rising in her chest, like water filling a sinking boat. If he claimed her here, tonight, in front of the entire court, everything would unravel. Every secret she had protected, every lie she had told to keep her mother safe. Every reason she had spent years staying invisible would be destroyed in a single moment, the instant the king's mark touched her skin, and the whole kingdom learned her name. "Please," she whispered, so only he could hear. "Please don't do this." Something flickered across his face, confusion mixing with the disbelief that was still written into every line of his expression. No Omega had ever refused a king. No one refused Cassian Thorne anything, not in 12 years of his reign. And yet here she was, staring up at him with terror instead of hope, begging him not to give her the one thing every other girl in the hall would have given anything to receive. "You don't want to be claimed," he said slowly, testing the words, like he did not quite believe them. "I can't be," Elira said. Her voice trembled, but she held his gaze. "You don't know what you'd be starting." The court around them began to whisper louder, confusion turning into scandal, turning into something closer to outrage. An Omega refusing the king. It was unheard of. Some of the nobles looked at her like she had lost her mind. Others looked at her like she had just committed a crime. Cassian raised a hand, and the hall fell silent again instantly. Obedience trained into every person present. He studied Elira for a long moment, his jaw tight, his eyes searching hers for something. Whatever he found there made him step back, just slightly, giving her the smallest amount of space. "Clear the hall," he said, his voice carrying easily across the enormous room. "The presentation is over." Gasps rippled through the crowd. Nobles exchanged startled glances. The other 11 Omegas were quickly herded away by attendants, some looking relieved, some looking cheated out of a chance they had desperately wanted. Guards began ushering the crowd toward the doors, and within minutes, the massive hall that had been filled with hundreds of people was nearly empty, leaving only Elira, the king, and a handful of guards, standing at a respectful distance near the walls. "Explain," Cassian said, once the doors had closed. It was not a demand shouted in anger. It was quiet, careful, like he was trying very hard not to frighten her further. Elira wrapped her arms around herself. Her heart was still pounding, but the panic had settled into something colder and more focused. "You said 3 years, she said instead of answering him. "What do you mean?" Cassian's expression shifted, and for a moment, the powerful king disappeared entirely, replaced by someone who looked almost young, almost unguarded. "You truly don't remember." "Remember what?" He walked slowly toward one of the tall windows lining the hall, staring out at the darkening sky beyond the glass. 3 years ago, in the autumn, there was an attack near the northern border. A group of rogue wolves crossed into unclaimed territory and attacked a caravan of travelers. He paused. There was a girl among them, alone, running through the trees. She had been separated from the group she was traveling with. The rogues had nearly caught her when someone intervened. Elira felt the blood drain from her face. She remembered that night in fragments, the way memories from childhood terror often remain, sharp in some places and blurred in others. She remembered running through the dark. She remembered the sound of claws tearing through underbrush behind her. She remembered a masked stranger appearing out of nowhere, fighting off 3 rogue wolves at once, moving with a speed and strength that seemed impossible. She remembered being pulled behind him, shielded by his body, and the low growl in his chest that had somehow made her feel safer instead of more afraid. She remembered his eyes, storm gray, fierce, and burning with something she had been too young and too terrified to understand at the time. "That was you," she whispered. "That was me," Cassian said, turning back to face her. "I never saw your face clearly. It was dark, and you fled the moment the danger passed, before I could stop you. But I caught your scent, and a king never forgets the scent of his fated mate." The words hit Elira like a physical blow. Fated mate, the bond that pack legend said the moon itself created between 2 souls, unbreakable, undeniable, the single thread that connected an alpha to the one person meant to stand beside him for the rest of his life. "I searched for you," Cassian continued, his voice rough now, stripped of the careful control he usually wore like armor. "Every territory, every pack gathering, every presentation for 3 years, hoping your scent would appear among the candidates. I began to think I had imagined it, that grief over losing you before I even found you had made me delusional." His eyes met hers again, steady and unbearably honest. "And then tonight, you walked through those doors, and I knew. I would know that scent anywhere. I would know you anywhere." Elira's hands were shaking. 3 years of running, 3 years of hiding, and somehow, impossibly, the past had reached out and found her anyway, wearing a crown, and standing in front of her with an expression of raw, unguarded need. "I'm grateful," she said carefully, forcing her voice to remain steady, even as her mind spun. I never got to thank you for saving my life that night, but your majesty, I meant what I said. You cannot claim me. Why? The question hung in the air between them, simple and impossible to answer honestly. Elira thought of her mother, lying weak and fading in the small cottage at the edge of Voss territory, the illness slowly stealing her strength week by week. She thought of the truth about their bloodline, buried carefully behind generations of silence, because the wrong people learning it could mean death for every Voss who carried the blood. There are things about my family you don't know, she said finally. Things that would put you, and your crown, and everyone connected to you in danger if they became public. Claiming me tonight, in front of the entire court, would expose all of it before I could protect the people I love from the consequences. Cassian studied her for a long moment, and Elira braced herself for anger, for the kind of cold fury that stories said kings reserved for defiance. Instead, something in his shoulders eased, just slightly, like he was recalculating an entire plan in real time. Then I won't claim you, he said. Not tonight, not until you're ready. Elira blinked, caught off guard by the sudden gentleness in his voice. You're a king. You don't have to wait for anything. I waited 3 years to find you, Cassian said. I can wait longer to earn you. He stepped closer, slowly, giving her every opportunity to step back if she wanted to. She didn't. But understand this. The bond between us already exists. I felt it the moment you walked through those doors, and I suspect, whether you admit it or not, that you felt it too. It does not disappear because we choose to ignore it. It will only grow, whether we want it to or not. Elira wanted to argue, wanted to insist that she had felt nothing but fear and panic since the moment she arrived at the palace gates that morning. But it would have been a lie, and something about the steady, searching way Cassian looked at her made lying feel impossible. The truth was, since the second his eyes had locked onto hers across that crowded hall, something inside her chest had shifted into place, quiet and certain, like a key turning in a lock she had not known existed. It terrified her far more than his crown, or his title, or the guards standing along the walls ever could. What happens now? She asked. Cassian considered the question carefully. You'll stay in the palace, he said, not as my claimed mate. As a guest. I'll have you placed under the healer's staff, given your evident knowledge of medicine. His eyes flicked briefly to the small leather satchel she still carried at her side, the one filled with herbs and remedies she had brought out of habit, never expecting to need them in a royal court. It will explain your presence without revealing anything you're not ready to share. And my mother, Elira said quickly, before she could stop herself. She's ill. I can't leave her alone for long. Something shifted in Cassian's expression, an offer forming, before he even spoke it aloud. Tell me what she needs, and it will be provided. Healers, medicine, anything within my power. Elira stared at him, unable to reconcile the powerful, untouchable king from the stories, with the man standing in front of her now, offering resources and protection to a stranger who had just refused him in front of his entire court. Why would you do that for someone you don't even know? Because the moon already chose you, Cassian said simply. I am only trying to catch up. The silence that followed was heavier than any argument could have been. Elira felt the weight of an entire future pressing down on the moment, a future she had spent 3 years trying to avoid, standing now directly in front of her with storm-gray eyes, and a patience she had never expected a king to possess. I need time, she finally said. Then you'll have it, Cassian answered. I've waited 3 years already. I can survive a little longer. He extended a hand, not to claim her, not to mark her, simply to offer support, as she stepped down from the small platform where the Omegas had been displayed. Let me show you to your quarters. Elira hesitated only a moment before placing her hand in his. The instant their skin touched, warmth spread up her arm like sunlight breaking through clouds after a long storm, and despite every warning bell ringing in her mind, despite every reason she had to run, some small and long-buried part of her finally, quietly, stopped fighting. They walked together out of the great hall, leaving behind the empty thrones and dimming torches, and Elira could not shake the feeling that she had just stepped through a door she would never be able to close again. Somewhere behind them, in the shadows near one of the towering pillars, a pair of pale eyes watched the two of them leave, calculating, patient, and already planning how to use what they had just witnessed. The night air outside the hall was cool and sharp, carrying the scent of pine and distant rain. Illyra walked beside the king through corridors lined with portraits of past rulers, her mind spinning through everything that had happened in the span of a single hour. 3 years ago, a masked stranger had saved her life in a dark forest, and vanished before she could thank him. Tonight, that same stranger had turned out to be the most powerful man in the kingdom, and instead of claiming her the moment he found her, he had chosen, against everything she understood about royal tradition, to wait. She did not know yet whether that choice would save her, or whether it would only delay the moment everything she had worked so hard to protect finally came crashing down around her. But as they walked deeper into the palace, past guards who bowed their heads, and servants who whispered behind their hands, Illyra understood one thing with absolute certainty. Her old life, the quiet, invisible existence she had built so carefully over the years, was already gone. Whatever came next, there would be no going back to who she was before those doors had opened. Cassian led her through a wide archway, into a quieter wing of the palace, away from the noise and the whispers, where the walls were lined with soft lantern light instead of blazing torches. He stopped in front of a heavy wooden door and turned to face her, his expression unreadable in the dim light. "This will be your room while you stay here," he said. "No one will enter without your permission, not even me." Illyra looked at the door, then back at him. "Thank you," she said quietly, and meant it more than she expected to. He nodded once, then hesitated, as though there was something more he wanted to say, but could not quite find the words for. Finally, he simply said, "Rest well, Illyra Voss," her name unfamiliar and careful in his mouth, like he was testing the shape of it for the first time. "You know my name," she said, surprised. "I asked one of the attendants the moment I recovered from the shock of seeing you," he admitted, and for the briefest moment, something almost boyish flickered across his features, a small crack in the composed king she had met only hours before. "I did not want to spend another 3 years not knowing it." Illyra felt her chest tighten with an emotion she could not quite name, something caught between fear and warmth, and a longing she had buried so deeply she had almost forgotten it existed. "Good night, Your Majesty," she said softly, and slipped through the door before he could see whatever expression had settled onto her own face. Once inside, she leaned back against the heavy wood and closed her eyes, listening to the fading sound of his footsteps retreating down the corridor. Her heart was still racing, her mind still spinning through everything that had happened, but beneath the fear and the uncertainty, something new had taken root, small and fragile and utterly unexpected. For 3 years, she had told herself the memory of the forest, the masked stranger, and the storm-gray eyes was nothing more than a moment of luck in a dangerous night, something to be grateful for and then forgotten. She had never imagined that memory would walk back into her life wearing a crown, offering patience instead of demands, protection instead of danger. She had never imagined that the very thing she feared most, being seen, being known, being chosen, might also be the thing she had been quietly hoping for all along. Outside, in the corridor beyond her door, Cassian Thorne stood motionless for a long moment, before finally turning away. 3 years of searching had led him to this night, and though he had not claimed her, though he had let her walk into that room alone and unmarked, he felt something settle inside his chest that had been missing since the night he lost her in the dark forest. She was here. She was real. And whatever secret she was hiding, whatever danger she believed her bloodline carried, he intended to stand beside her through every bit of it, for as long as it took to earn the trust she was not yet ready to give. As he walked back toward his own chambers, his mind already turning toward the questions he needed answered. Who was Illyra Voss, truly? What secret was dangerous enough to make a girl refuse a king? And who, in the shadows of his own court, had been watching closely enough tonight to already begin planning how to turn that secret into a weapon? The palace settled into a tense and uncertain quiet as the night deepened, but for 2 people within its walls, sleep would not come easily. One lay awake, wondering how long she could keep the truth hidden. The other lay awake wondering how quickly he could make her feel safe enough to share it. And somewhere in the shadows between them, a bond neither of them had chosen, but both of them now carried, pulsed quietly in the dark, patient, persistent, and utterly unwilling to be ignored. Morning came too fast for Illyra. sunlight cutting through the tall window of her new room and pulling her from a sleep that had been shallow and restless. For a moment she forgot where she was, and then the memory of the previous night rushed back in a single overwhelming wave. The presentation, the king, the forest 3 years ago. She sat up quickly, pressing a hand to her chest, as though she could physically slow her own racing heart. A soft knock sounded at the door before she had even finished dressing. She opened it cautiously, to find a young woman, with warm brown skin and a kind smile standing in the hallway. A folded set of healer's robes draped over one arm. "Good morning," the woman said cheerfully. "My name is Nora. I work in the palace infirmary. His Majesty asked that I show you around and get you settled before your first shift." Alira accepted the robes, still trying to process how quickly her life had rearranged itself overnight. "Thank you, Nora." As they walked together through the palace corridors, Nora chattered easily about the daily routines of the infirmary, the herbs stocked in its stores, and the various healers Alira would be working alongside. It was, Alira realized with some surprise, a genuine relief to focus on something practical after the emotional chaos of the night before. Healing was familiar, healing was safe. It was the one part of herself she had never needed to hide. "So," Nora said eventually, glancing sideways with poorly disguised curiosity, "is it true the king stopped the entire presentation for you?" Alira felt her face warm. "It's complicated. Everyone's talking about it," Nora continued, undeterred. "Some of the older healers say they've never seen him show interest in anyone before. He's always been so guarded. Some people even started calling him the waiting king, because he never chose anyone at any presentation, no matter how many years passed." The waiting king. Alira turned the words over in her mind, thinking of what he had told her the night before. 3 years of searching, 3 years of holding on to a single memory of a girl he had never even properly seen. It was difficult to reconcile that image with the cold, untouchable ruler she had expected to meet. The infirmary itself was a long, bright room, filled with neat rows of shelves stocked with dried herbs, tinctures, and bandages. Alira felt an immediate sense of familiarity as she stepped inside, the scent of dried lavender and crushed mint, reminding her instantly of her mother's small cottage. She spent the morning learning the layout of the supplies, treating a handful of minor injuries among the palace staff, and slowly settling into a rhythm that felt, for the first time since arriving, almost normal. It was near midday when Cassian appeared in the infirmary doorway. He looked different in daylight, less like the imposing figure from the throne room, and more like an ordinary man, dressed simply in dark trousers and a plain gray shirt, his sleeves rolled to his forearms. Every healer in the room straightened immediately, bowing their heads, but his eyes went directly to Alira, the same way they had the night before, as though the rest of the room had simply ceased to exist. "Might I borrow your newest healer for a walk?" he asked the head physician, though his eyes never left Alira's face. The head physician, an older man with silver hair and a knowing smile, waved a hand. "Of course, Your Majesty. She's been doing wonderfully." Alira set down the bundle of bandages she had been folding, and followed Cassian out into a wide courtyard garden she had not yet had the chance to explore. Late morning sunlight filtered through the leaves of tall trees, and the air smelled faintly of blooming flowers. It was quiet here, private, a world away from the tension of the throne room the night before. "You didn't have to check on me," Alira said, as they walked along a stone path lined with rose bushes. "I wanted to," Cassian admitted. "I also wanted to ask if you'd received word from your mother's healer this morning. I sent someone at dawn to check on her condition, as promised." Alira stopped walking, surprised. "You already sent someone?" "I told you I would," he said simply. "A king who breaks his word to the person he intends to earn is not much of a king at all." The messenger's report had arrived only an hour earlier, and Alira had not yet had the chance to read it fully, in the chaos of settling into her new duties. She pulled the small folded note from her satchel now, scanning it quickly, relief washing through her as she read that her mother remained stable, resting comfortably under the care of the healer Cassian had sent. "Thank you," she said quietly, looking up at him. "Truly." Cassian nodded, but something in his expression shifted, growing more serious. "Alira, I don't want to push you before you're ready, but I need to understand what kind of danger surrounds you, if I'm going to protect you properly. You mentioned your bloodline last night. What did you mean?" Elira's chest tightened. She had known this conversation would come eventually, but she had hoped for more time to prepare herself for it. She glanced around the garden, checking for any nearby guards or servants who might overhear, before answering carefully. "There's a story," she began slowly, "about a line of wolves who lived centuries ago, before your family's rule was even established. They were said to carry a kind of magic, tied not to strength or speed, like most gifted bloodlines, but to healing itself. Wounds that should have taken weeks to close would mend in days under their touch. Sicknesses that should have been fatal would simply fade away." Cassian listened intently, his expression unreadable. "The old rulers feared that kind of power," Elira continued. "A gift that could undo death itself was considered dangerous in the wrong hands, a threat to the natural order between life and the moon's will. So they hunted the bloodline, until it was believed to be wiped out entirely." She met his eyes. It wasn't. A few survived, hidden, scattered across small, unremarkable packs, passing the gift quietly through generations, never speaking of it, never using it openly enough to be noticed. "And you're one of them," Cassian said quietly. Elira nodded. "My mother taught me everything about herbs and medicine, so that if the gift ever surfaced in me, it would look like simple skill rather than something unnatural. But lately, her illness has grown resistant to every remedy we've tried. Nothing we do slows it. And I'm terrified that if I try to use whatever is truly inside me to save her, someone will notice, and everything my family has hidden for generations will unravel." Cassian was quiet for a long moment, processing everything she had told him. "That's why you didn't want to be claimed," he said finally. "Not because you didn't want me. Because being claimed by a king means being seen by everyone connected to that king, and you couldn't risk anyone looking closely enough to notice what you truly are." "Yes," Elira admitted. "I won't tell anyone," Cassian said firmly. "Not my council, not my guards, no one. Your secret is safe with me for as long as you need it to be." Elira studied his face, searching for any trace of deception, and finding none. "Why does this matter so much to you?" "You barely know me." "I know enough," Cassian said. "I know you ran toward danger to try and warn a group of strangers that night in the forest, before I ever intervened. I know you've spent years hiding a part of yourself out of love for your mother, rather than fear for your own safety. I know that even terrified of what claiming me might cost you, you still thanked me, instead of resenting me for finding you." He stepped closer. "I don't need 3 more years to know the kind of person you are, Elira. I already know enough to be certain the moon didn't make a mistake." Something in Elira's chest ached at his words, a longing she had spent years suppressing, rising dangerously close to the surface. She wanted to believe him. She wanted, more than she was willing to admit even to herself, to stop carrying every secret alone. Their quiet moment was interrupted by the sound of footsteps on the garden path. A woman approached, elegant and sharp-featured, wearing robes embroidered with silver thread that marked her as a member of the king's council. Her pale eyes moved over Elira with open assessment, before settling on Cassian, with a smile that did not quite reach her gaze. "Your Majesty," the woman said smoothly, "forgive the interruption. Council matters require your attention." "Ophelia," Cassian said, his tone cooling noticeably. "This is Elira Voss." Ophelia's smile sharpened. "Ah, yes. The healer who refused a crown. The whole court is speaking of nothing else." Her eyes lingered on Elira a moment too long. How refreshing, to see someone so uninterested in power. Elira felt the underlying edge in the woman's words but kept her expression neutral. "It was never about power," she said simply. "I only asked for time." "Of course," Ophelia said lightly, though her eyes told a different story entirely. "Your Majesty, the council awaits." Cassian glanced back at Elira, something apologetic in his gaze. "I'll find you again soon," he promised, before following Ophelia back toward the palace. Elira remained in the garden a moment longer, watching them go, an uneasy feeling settling in her stomach that had nothing to do with the fear of being discovered. There had been something calculating in the way Ophelia looked at her, something that suggested the councilwoman had already begun forming plans of her own. She thought of Cassian's promise to keep her secret safe, and she wanted desperately to believe the danger was contained to only him. But standing alone in the quiet garden, watching Ophelia's retreating figure disappear into the shadows of the palace, Elira could not shake the growing certainty that her secret was no longer as safe as the king believed it to be. The rest of the day passed in a blur of infirmary duties and careful, watchful silence. Elira threw herself into her work, grateful for the distraction, treating minor burns and stitching small wounds among the palace staff, while her mind continued circling back to the conversation in the garden. By evening, exhaustion had settled deep into her bones, both physical and emotional, and she retreated gratefully to the quiet privacy of her room. She had barely settled onto the edge of her bed when a soft knock sounded at the door. Opening it, she found Cassian standing in the corridor, still dressed in the same simple clothes from earlier, though the weight of a long day of council meetings showed clearly in the tired lines around his eyes. "I know it's late," he said. "I only wanted to make sure you were settling in well." Elira stepped aside, allowing him into the room, surprising herself with how natural the gesture felt despite everything. "The council meeting went that long?" "Council meetings always go long when everyone has an opinion about the same subject," he said, a tired smile tugging at the corner of his mouth. "You, apparently, are quite the popular topic today." "I'm sorry," Elira said, though the apology felt strange on her tongue. "Don't be," Cassian said. "I'd rather deal with 100 council meetings than lose the chance to know you." He hesitated near the window, looking out at the darkened gardens below. "Ophelia has served on my council since before I took the throne. She's ambitious and not always trustworthy, but she's clever. I want you to be careful around her." "I already sensed as much," Elira admitted. Cassian turned back to face her, his expression serious. "If she ever learns what you told me about your bloodline, she would not hesitate to use it against both of us. Please, be careful what you share, and with whom." "I will," Elira promised. They stood together in comfortable silence for a moment, the tension of the day slowly easing between them. Elira found herself studying his face in the dim lantern light, the tired lines around his eyes, the quiet steadiness of his presence, despite the exhaustion clearly weighing on him. It was strange how quickly the terrifying stranger from the throne room had become something closer to familiar, even comforting. "Thank you for today," she said softly, "for sending help to my mother, for trusting me with the truth about how you found me." "Thank you for trusting me with your secret," Cassian replied. "I know that wasn't easy." He lingered near the door, a moment longer than necessary, before finally stepping back into the corridor. "Rest well, Elira. Tomorrow will be calmer, I hope." But as he disappeared down the hallway, and Elira closed the door behind him, she could not shake the uneasy feeling that had settled over her in the garden that afternoon. Ophelia's sharp, assessing gaze lingered in her memory, patient and calculating, in a way that made Elira's instincts scream warning. Whatever calm Cassian hoped tomorrow would bring, Elira suspected it would not last nearly as long as either of them wanted it to. Elira's temporary position in the palace began to feel less temporary with each passing week. She was given a permanent room in the healer's wing, a small but comfortable space with a window overlooking the eastern gardens, and a growing list of responsibilities that kept her hands busy and her mind, for the most part, distracted from the constant undercurrent of tension surrounding her presence at court. Cassian found reasons to see her nearly every day. Sometimes it was practical, a report on her mother's condition, a question about herbs needed for the infirmary, a request for her opinion on a matter of pack medicine. More often, it was simply because he wanted to see her, and he had stopped pretending otherwise. They walked together through the gardens in the evenings when his duties allowed. He began teaching her to identify the different territories marked on the enormous map that covered one wall of his private study, tracing borders with careful fingers while she watched, more interested in the low, steady sound of his voice than the geography itself. It was during one of these evening walks, nearly 3 weeks after the presentation, that Elira found herself laughing, for the first time since arriving at the palace, genuinely and without restraint, at a story Cassian told about a disastrous diplomatic dinner he had attended, as a much younger man, before he had fully grown into the composed ruler she knew now. "You actually spilled wine on the visiting Alpha's robes," she asked, disbelief coloring her voice. "Directly into his lap," Cassian confirmed, an unguarded smile spreading across his face, the kind of smile Elira had rarely seen from him, boyish and completely without the weight of the crown. "My father nearly had me sent to the border patrol out of pure embarrassment. I can't imagine you clumsy at anything." Illyra said, still smiling. I was 17 and terrified, Cassian admitted. Diplomacy takes practice, same as anything else. They had stopped walking, standing together beneath a large flowering tree at the edge of the garden, the last light of evening, painting the sky in soft shades of orange and pink. Illyra became suddenly aware of how close they were standing, how naturally her hand had found its way near his during the walk, how easily the space between them had shrunk over the past few weeks, without either of them fully acknowledging it. Illyra, Cassian said quietly, his voice losing its playful edge. Yes? I know I promised to wait, he said carefully, and I intend to keep that promise. But I need you to know that what I feel for you isn't only the bond. I would want to know you even without it. These past weeks, watching you work in the infirmary, listening to you talk about the herbs your mother taught you, seeing how carefully you treat every person who comes to you for help, regardless of their status or wealth. I've fallen for the person you are, not simply the fate that connected us. Illyra's heart ached with the honesty in his words, and she felt her own carefully maintained walls beginning to crack under the weight of feelings she had been trying desperately to ignore. I've felt it too, she admitted quietly, longer than I want to admit. Cassian's eyes softened, hope flickering openly across his features. Then why do you still hesitate? Because feeling something for you doesn't erase the danger, Illyra said, though the words carried less conviction now than they once had. If anything, it makes it worse. The more I care about you, the more I have to lose if my secret comes out. I would protect you, Cassian said firmly. Whatever came, whoever tried to use it against you, I would stand between you and every bit of it. I know you believe that, Illyra said softly. But Cassian, you're a king. Your enemies would use any weakness they could find, and a forbidden bloodline hiding within your court, one your own crown once hunted, would be exactly the kind of weakness they'd been waiting for. Cassian was quiet for a long moment, considering her words carefully rather than dismissing them, which was, Illyra realized, one of the many things that had slowly won her over these past weeks. He never brushed aside her fears. He listened, weighed them seriously, and responded with honesty, rather than empty reassurance. Then we protect the secret together, he said finally, not through hiding, but through preparation. Let me help you understand exactly what your gift is capable of, quietly, carefully, away from prying eyes. If we understand its full nature, we can control how and when it's ever revealed, rather than living in constant fear of it being discovered by accident. The suggestion surprised her. In all her years of careful concealment, she had never considered actually exploring the extent of her abilities, always too afraid of what using them openly might invite. You would help me with that? I would help you with anything, Cassian said simply. They began meeting quietly in a small private chamber near his study, away from the busy corridors of the main palace, twice a week in the evenings after Illyra's infirmary duties ended. At first, she was hesitant, testing only the smallest edges of her ability, closing minor cuts on her own skin, easing small bruises. But with Cassian's steady encouragement and the safety of complete privacy, she slowly began to understand the true depth of what she carried. It was during one of these sessions, nearly a month after the presentation, that everything changed. A young guard, barely older than Illyra herself, was brought urgently to the private chamber after a training accident left a deep wound across his side, bleeding heavily, despite the attending healer's best efforts to control it. Cassian, recognizing the severity immediately, made a decision that would have been unthinkable only weeks earlier. Illyra, he said urgently, can you help him? Illyra looked at the pale, frightened young guard, blood soaking through the bandages pressed against his side, and understood immediately that ordinary herbs and stitches would not be enough to save him in time. She made her decision in an instant, kneeling beside him and placing both hands directly over the wound. Warmth spread from her palms, golden and steady, and she felt the familiar pull of energy she had spent years suppressing, finally released fully for the first time. The guard gasped as the bleeding slowed, then stopped entirely, the torn flesh beneath her hands slowly knitting itself back together in a way that should have taken weeks compressed into mere minutes. When she finally sat back, breathless and drained, the wound had closed completely, leaving only a thin pink line, where moments before there had been a life-threatening injury. The young guard stared down at his own side in stunned disbelief, then up at Alira with wide, awestruck eyes. "How?" he whispered. "How did you do that?" Cassian moved quickly, placing a firm hand on the guard's shoulder. "What you witnessed tonight does not leave this room," he said, his voice carrying the full authority of the crown. "This healer possesses a rare and private gift, and her safety depends entirely on discretion. Do you understand?" The young guard, still shaken, but clearly grateful to be alive, nodded quickly. "Yes, Your Majesty, I understand. I owe her my life. I would never betray that." Once the guard had been escorted away by another attendant, sworn to silence, Alira sank into a chair, exhaustion washing over her in heavy waves. Cassian knelt beside her immediately, concern etched deeply into his features. "Are you all right?" "Tired," Alira admitted. "Using it fully like that, it takes more out of me than I expected." "You saved his life," Cassian said softly, taking her hand gently in his. "I've never seen anything like what you just did." "It's dangerous," Alira reminded him, though there was less fear in her voice now than pride, a small, cautious warmth at having finally used the gift she had spent her whole life suppressing, to save someone, rather than being punished for it. One witness tonight. If word spreads even slightly beyond this room, everything could unravel. "It won't," Cassian promised. "I'll make certain of it." But as the weeks continued, and Alira's confidence in her abilities slowly grew, so too did the number of people who began to notice the strange, quiet closeness between the healer and the king. The private meetings, the lingering glances, the way Cassian's guarded demeanor softened whenever she entered a room. Court gossip, already stirred by the unprecedented events of the presentation, only intensified. Ophelia Rourke watched it all unfold with careful, patient interest, gathering fragments of information from whispered rumors and careless servants, piecing together a picture that grew more valuable with each passing week. She had not forgotten the strange, guarded look in Alira's eyes during their brief meeting in the garden weeks earlier, nor the way the young healer had chosen her words about her family with such deliberate care. Late one evening, as Alira returned from another private training session with Cassian, exhausted but quietly content, in a way she had not felt in years, she failed to notice the pale eyes watching her from the shadows of a nearby corridor, calculating, patient, and finally beginning to form a plan. Ophelia had spent weeks gathering fragments, testing loyalties among the palace staff, offering careful favors in exchange for careless observations. She had learned of unusual late-night visits to a private chamber near the king's study. She had learned of a guard who had suffered a severe training injury and returned to duty the very next morning without a single visible scar. She had learned that the king, famous throughout the kingdom for his composed and unreadable temperament, had become visibly, unmistakably transformed by the presence of a single, unassuming healer. It was not yet enough to act upon, not yet proof of anything beyond simple romantic interest. But Ophelia had built her position on the council through patience and careful observation, and she was confident that whatever secret Alira Voss was hiding, it was significant enough to be worth the wait required to uncover it fully. As autumn settled fully over the kingdom, bringing cooler winds and shorter days, Alira allowed herself, cautiously and carefully, to believe that perhaps her secret might remain safe after all, protected by Cassian's discretion and the loyalty of the few who now knew the truth. She allowed herself to imagine, in quiet, unguarded moments, what a future beside him might actually look like, free from fear, free from hiding. She did not yet know how closely she was being watched, or how quickly the fragile peace she had built within the palace walls was about to be shattered entirely. The first frost of the season arrived quietly, coating the palace gardens in a thin layer of silver that sparkled beneath the early morning sun. Alira had grown accustomed to the rhythm of her new life, the infirmary duties that filled her mornings, the quiet training sessions with Cassian that filled her evenings, and the strange, comforting sense that for the first time in years, she was not entirely alone in carrying the weight of her family's secret. Her mother's condition remained a constant worry in the back of her mind, but the healer Cassian had sent continued to provide steady care, and the reports arriving each week brought small but encouraging signs of stability. Alira found herself daring to hope, cautiously and quietly, that perhaps a solution existed somewhere, if only she looked hard enough. It was during one of her evening sessions with Cassian that the idea first took shape. "There are old records in the royal archive," Cassian said, watching as Alira carefully closed a small cut on her own palm, testing the precision of her control, rather than the raw strength she had used weeks earlier on the injured guard. Records dating back centuries, before my family's rule was even fully established. If your bloodline's history is as old as you believe, there might be information there about the illness affecting your mother, or at least about the full extent of what your gift is capable of treating. Alira looked up, cautious hope flickering in her chest. Do you think there could be something about a cure? I don't know, Cassian admitted honestly, but it's worth searching. The archive is not commonly used, and access is restricted enough that we could search quietly, without drawing unwanted attention. They began spending their evenings in the vast, dusty archive beneath the western wing of the palace, instead of the private training chamber, surrounded by towering shelves of ancient texts and yellowed scrolls that had not been disturbed in generations. The work was slow and tedious, translating faded handwriting in old dialects, cross-referencing fragments of information scattered across dozens of different sources. But Alira found a strange comfort in the quiet, methodical search, especially with Cassian beside her, patient and determined, refusing to give up even as weeks passed without significant progress. It was on a cold evening in late autumn, nearly 2 months after the presentation, that Alira finally found something. Cassian, she called softly, careful not to disturb the heavy silence of the archive. Look at this. He crossed the room quickly, leaning over her shoulder to examine the ancient scroll she had carefully unrolled across the wooden table. The text was faded and difficult to read, but the illustration accompanying it was unmistakable. A detailed drawing of a wolf, marked with the same subtle silver pattern that Alira had noticed appearing faintly along her own forearm whenever she used her gift at its fullest strength. This describes the illness, Alira said, her voice trembling slightly with a mixture of excitement and disbelief. It says here that the healing gift, when used repeatedly to sustain a body beyond its natural limits, can eventually weaken the healer's own bloodline, passing a kind of exhaustion down through generations if not properly managed. She looked up at Cassian, understanding dawning slowly and painfully. My mother's illness. It's not separate from our gift. It's caused by it. Someone in our bloodline, generations ago, must have overused the gift to save someone, and the consequence has been quietly weakening our family ever since. Cassian studied the scroll carefully, his expression thoughtful. Does it mention a treatment? Alira continued reading, her heart pounding, as she translated the faded text word by word. It says the exhaustion can be reversed, but only through a specific ritual, one that requires the willing exchange of strength between a healer of the bloodline and someone bonded to them by fate. She looked up at him slowly, the implication settling heavily between them, a fated mate. The archive fell silent as the weight of the discovery settled over both of them. Alira's mind raced through the implications. If the text was accurate, the very bond she had spent months trying to avoid, the very claim she had begged Cassian not to make on the night of the presentation, might be the exact thing capable of saving her mother's life. Alira, Cassian said carefully, watching the conflicting emotions playing across her face. This doesn't mean you have to decide anything right now, but if this ritual could help your mother, I want you to know that I would do it without hesitation, whenever you're ready. It's not that simple, Alira said, though her voice wavered with uncertainty now, rather than firm refusal. The ritual requires a full claiming, doesn't it? Not a partial bond, not simply an acknowledgement. A complete, public claim, exactly the thing I've been trying to avoid this entire time. Cassian nodded slowly. It appears so. Alira sat back, overwhelmed by the sudden collision of everything she had feared and everything she desperately wanted. Saving her mother had been the singular driving fear behind every decision she had made since arriving at the palace, and now the ancient text before her suggested that the solution had been standing beside her in the archive every single evening for the past 2 months, patient and unclaimed, waiting for her to be ready. I need time to think, she said finally. Take all the time you need, Cassian said gently. This isn't a decision to make quickly, out of desperation. If we move forward with the claiming, I want it to be because you're ready, not simply because circumstances forced your hand. Alira appreciated his patience more than she could properly express, but as she carefully rolled the ancient scroll and returned it to its shelf, she could not shake the growing awareness that time, the one thing Cassian had promised her freely since the night of the presentation, might be the one resource she no longer had the luxury of spending carelessly. That night, as she walked back toward the healer's wing alone, her mind still spinning with the discovery in the archive, she failed to notice the figure watching her from the shadows near the archive entrance. Ophelia Rourke had followed the pair for the past several evenings, patient and persistent, and tonight, for the first time, she had managed to overhear enough of the conversation drifting through the partially open archive door to piece together the outline of something far more significant than simple romantic interest. A forbidden bloodline, a healing gift powerful enough to require ancient rituals to control. A King's Council member did not need to understand every detail to recognize the value of what she had just discovered. Ophelia smiled slowly to herself as she slipped quietly back through the shadowed corridors of the palace, already calculating exactly how such valuable information might be used, and to whom it might be worth the most. The following morning, Illyra woke early, her mind still heavy with the weight of the previous night's discovery. She dressed quickly and made her way toward the infirmary, hoping the familiar routine of her healing duties might help settle the storm of conflicting emotions still swirling inside her. She had not gone far when Nora intercepted her in the corridor, her usually cheerful expression replaced by something more cautious. "Illyra," Nora said quietly, glancing around before continuing, "I heard something this morning I think you should know. One of the kitchen staff mentioned that Lady Ophelia has been asking unusual questions, about you specifically, about where you came from, about your family." Illyra's stomach dropped. "What kind of questions?" "Nothing overt," Nora said, "but enough to seem strange, given how little attention she's paid to any of the other new staff members. I thought you should be careful." Illyra thanked Nora for the warning, her mind already racing through the implications. If Ophelia had begun actively investigating her background, it meant the councilwoman suspected something significant, something worth the effort of digging beneath the surface. Combined with the archive discovery from the night before, the timing felt far too dangerous to be coincidental. She found Cassian later that afternoon, pulling him aside from his usual council duties to share Nora's warning. His expression darkened immediately, concern hardening into something more protective. "I'll have her watched," he said firmly, quietly, without drawing suspicion. "If she's investigating you, I need to know exactly what she's uncovered, and how far she intends to take it." "Cassian," Illyra said carefully, "if she learns the truth before we're ready, before we've decided anything about the ritual, about the claiming, everything could unravel far faster than either of us can control." "I know," Cassian said, his jaw tight with restrained frustration. "Which is exactly why we need to move carefully, and quickly. I won't let her use this against you, Illyra, whatever it takes." Despite his reassurance, a cold, creeping dread had settled into Illyra's chest, one that refused to fully dissipate, no matter how firmly Cassian promised to protect her. The archive discovery had offered a fragile thread of hope for her mother's recovery, but it had also revealed, with painful clarity, exactly how narrow the path forward truly was, and how easily it might be severed by someone patient enough, and cruel enough, to exploit every secret standing between Illyra and the safety she had spent her entire life trying to protect. As the days grew shorter and the first true chill of winter began settling over the kingdom, Illyra found herself caught between two futures, each pulling at her with equal and opposing force. One path led toward the claiming, toward saving her mother, toward finally allowing herself the future with Cassian that some quiet, long-buried part of her had been hoping for since the moment his storm-gray eyes first found hers across the crowded hall. The other path led toward continued secrecy, continued caution, continued protection of a truth that had kept her family safe for generations, even as it now threatened to cost her mother's life. She did not yet know which path she would ultimately choose. But as Ophelia's shadow continued to lengthen quietly across the palace corridors, patient and calculating, Illyra understood with growing certainty that the choice, whatever it turned out to be, would not remain hers to make in peace for very much longer. Winter settled fully over the kingdom, blanketing the palace grounds in thick white snow and turning the once colorful gardens into quiet, frozen landscapes. Despite the growing danger surrounding her secret, Illyra found that her connection with Cassian had only deepened over the following weeks, strengthened rather than weakened by the shared weight of the decision they were both slowly building toward. They no longer met only in the archive or the private training chamber. Cassian began inviting her to join him for quiet dinners in his personal chambers, away from the watchful eyes of the court, where conversation flowed easily between them, ranging from childhood memories to hopes for the future, from the practical burdens of ruling a kingdom to the simple, ordinary pleasures neither of them had allowed themselves to enjoy in far too long. My father used to say, "A king who cannot laugh has already lost half of what makes him worth following," Cassian told her one evening, as they sat together near the fireplace in his chambers, the warm glow casting soft shadows across the room. "I forgot that lesson for a long time, after he passed, and the full weight of the crown fell onto my shoulders. I forgot it, until you walked through those doors." Alira smiled, warmth spreading through her chest at the quiet vulnerability in his admission. "You laugh plenty now." "Only because of you," Cassian said simply. The bond between them, the one Alira had spent so long trying to resist, no longer felt like a threat looming over her future. It felt instead like something steady and true, a foundation she found herself leaning on more and more with each passing day. She still carried fear, still carried the weight of her mother's illness and the ever-present danger of Ophelia's suspicions, but beside Cassian, that fear no longer felt like something she had to carry entirely alone. It was during one such quiet evening, nearly 3 months after the presentation, that Alira finally spoke the words she had been carefully considering for weeks. "I want to move forward with the ritual," she said softly, watching the firelight dance across Cassian's face as he looked up at her, surprise and hope mingling in his expression. "For my mother, and for us." Cassian rose slowly from his chair, crossing the room to kneel in front of where she sat, taking both her hands gently in his. "Are you certain? I don't want you to feel pressured by fear for your mother's life." "I'm certain," Alira said, and found, to her own quiet surprise, that she meant it completely. "I've spent my entire life hiding, running from what I am, terrified of being seen clearly enough to be understood. But these past months with you, I've realized that being seen isn't the danger I always believed it to be. Not when the person seeing me chooses to protect what he finds, rather than exploit it." Cassian's eyes shone with an emotion too large for words, and he pressed a gentle kiss to the back of her hand, a promise sealed quietly between them. "Then we'll do it properly," he said. "Not rushed, not hidden away out of fear, but exactly the way it should have happened from the beginning, when you're ready to stand beside me openly." They began planning quietly, carefully researching the exact requirements of the ancient ritual described in the archive scroll, consulting discreetly with the head physician, who had proven himself trustworthy over the months Alira had worked alongside him. The ritual, they learned, required privacy and specific timing, tied to the fullness of the winter moon, still several weeks away, giving them time to prepare properly. But even as hope grew steadily between them, the shadow of Ophelia's suspicion continued to darken the edges of their careful planning. Reports from the guards Cassian had quietly assigned to watch her confirmed that her investigation into Alira's background had only intensified, extending now beyond simple questions among the palace staff, to actual correspondence with contacts outside the palace walls, contacts whose loyalties remained deeply uncertain. "She's been sending letters," Cassian told Alira one evening, his expression grim as he shared the latest report from his guards. "To a pack leader in the southern territories, someone known for having little love for my crown. We don't yet know the full content of the correspondence, but the timing is troubling." Alira felt the familiar cold dread returning, tightening around her chest despite the warmth of the fire nearby. "Do you think she's already discovered enough to be dangerous?" "I don't know," Cassian admitted honestly. "But I think we need to move more quickly than we originally planned. The longer we wait, the more time she has to gather enough evidence to act against us." The decision to move the timeline forward brought a new urgency to their preparations, but also a fresh wave of anxiety that Alira found difficult to fully shake. The ritual required not only privacy and proper timing, but also complete trust between the two participants, an emotional vulnerability that went far beyond the simple mechanics of the magic involved. Alira found herself lying awake many nights, staring at the ceiling of her small room, wrestling with lingering fears that no amount of reassurance from Cassian could entirely erase. What if the ritual failed? What if her mother's illness was already too advanced to be reversed, even with the sacrifice the ancient text described? What if claiming her officially, publicly, exposed not only her own secret, but placed Cassian's entire reign in jeopardy, giving his enemies exactly the weapon Ophelia seemed determined to hand them. She shared these fears with Cassian during one of their evening meetings, unable to keep them contained any longer. "I understand your fear," Cassian said gently, once she had finished. "But Alira, I've spent my entire reign making careful, calculated decisions, weighing every risk against every potential reward. I've never once regretted choosing you, not for a single moment since that first night in the throne room. Whatever comes from this, whatever consequences follow, I would rather face them standing beside you than spend another lifetime waiting for a certainty that will never fully exist." His words settled something deep within her, a quiet reassurance that no amount of careful planning could have provided. She had spent so many years believing that safety meant invisibility, that protection meant isolation, that the only way to survive was to remain hidden and alone. Cassian had shown her, patiently and consistently over the past 3 months, that a different kind of safety existed, one built not on hiding, but on being fully known and fully accepted, regardless of the risks that acceptance carried. As the weeks passed, and the winter moon drew closer, Alira found herself preparing not only for the ritual itself, but for the life that would follow it, a life lived openly, without the constant exhausting burden of concealment she had carried for so long. She began, cautiously, to imagine a future where her gift was not a secret to be guarded, but a strength to be used freely, where her mother's health was not a constant source of fear, but a settled, peaceful certainty. But even as hope continued to bloom quietly between them, Ophelia's investigation continued its steady, patient progress in the shadows, gathering fragments of information that were slowly assembling themselves into a picture far more complete and far more dangerous than either Alira or Cassian yet realized. The Southern Pack leader Ophelia had been corresponding with had a long-standing grudge against the Thorn Crown, dating back to a territorial dispute from years before Cassian's reign began, and the promise of information capable of destabilizing the current king's authority was proving to be exactly the kind of leverage he had been waiting for. 3 days before the winter moon, as Alira and Cassian made their final quiet preparations for the ritual meant to save her mother's life and finally unite their fated bond, Ophelia Rourke received a response to her most recent letter, one that set in motion a chain of events neither Alira nor Cassian would see coming, until it was almost too late to stop. The Southern Pack leader's letter arrived at Ophelia's private chambers wrapped in plain, unmarked parchment, carried by a courier who had traveled through 3 days of harsh winter weather to deliver it discreetly. Ophelia read the contents by candlelight, a slow, satisfied smile spreading across her face as she absorbed every carefully worded promise contained within. His name was Roland Ashworth, leader of a large Southern Pack that had clashed with the Thorn Crown for control of disputed border territory, years before Cassian ever took the throne. The dispute had ended in Roland's humiliating defeat, a loss he had never fully accepted, and the years since had done nothing to soften his resentment toward the family that had cost him both land and pride. Ophelia's letters, carefully worded to avoid direct accusation, while still conveying the significance of what she had discovered, had been more than enough to capture his interest. His response promised substantial resources, political support, and a partnership that would benefit them both, in exchange for proof, solid and undeniable proof, that the current king harbored a forbidden bloodline within his own court, one his family had once sworn to eliminate entirely. Ophelia did not yet possess proof strong enough to satisfy such a demand. Suspicion and overheard fragments of conversation were not the same as verified fact, but 3 months of patient investigation had given her enough understanding of Alira's habits, her private meetings with the king, her unusual skill in the infirmary, to know exactly where to look for the confirmation she needed. The winter moon ritual, still unknown to Ophelia in its specific details, would take place in 3 days. She did not know its exact purpose, only that Cassian and Alira had been meeting with unusual frequency in recent weeks, and that whatever they were planning carried enough significance that both had grown increasingly cautious about being observed. Ophelia decided the time for patience had finally run its course. 2 days before the ritual, Alira noticed a change in the atmosphere of the palace, subtle but unmistakable to someone who had spent years learning to read the smallest signs of danger. Servants who usually greeted her warmly now offered only brief, hesitant nods. Guards seemed to watch her a moment too long, as she passed through the corridors. The comfortable rhythm she had built over the past 3 months felt suddenly fragile, as though the ground beneath her had shifted without warning. She mentioned the change to Cassian during their evening meeting, and his expression grew immediately serious. "My guards reported something troubling this morning," he admitted. "Ophelia met privately with a courier late last night, someone unfamiliar to the palace staff. We don't yet know the content of whatever message was exchanged, but the timing concerns me greatly." "Do you think she knows about the ritual?" Elira asked, fear creeping back into her voice, despite the months of growing confidence she had built alongside him. "I don't think she knows the specifics," Cassian said carefully. "But I think she knows enough to be dangerous, and I think whatever she's planning, she intends to act soon." They discussed moving the ritual forward, completing it that very night, rather than waiting the full 2 days, until the moon reached its true fullness. But the head physician, consulted urgently, warned strongly against it, explaining that the ritual's power depended entirely on the precise timing of the moon's peak, and that attempting it prematurely risked not only failure, but potential harm to both participants. "We wait," Cassian decided finally, though the tension in his voice betrayed how difficult the decision was to make. "But we increase security around both of you, until the ritual is complete. I won't take any further risks with your safety, Elira. Not when we're this close." The following day passed in tense, watchful silence. Elira continued her infirmary duties, forcing herself to maintain the appearance of normalcy, despite the anxiety coiling tightly in her chest. Cassian doubled the guards stationed near her wing of the palace, and personally reviewed every scheduled visitor to the infirmary, searching for any sign of the threat he suspected was building somewhere just out of sight. It was late in the evening, only hours before the winter moon would finally reach its peak, when the danger Cassian had feared finally revealed itself. A commotion erupted near the main gates of the palace, guards shouting, horses whinnying in alarm, the sound carrying clearly through the cold night air even from within the healer's wing. Elira rushed to the window, her heart pounding, and watched as a group of unfamiliar riders approached the palace grounds, under a raised banner she did not recognize, dark red, marked with a black hawk. Nora appeared at her door moments later, breathless and pale. "Elira, you need to come quickly. Lady Ophelia has summoned an emergency council session. She's making accusations, terrible accusations, about you and the king." Elira's blood ran cold. "What kind of accusations?" "She's claiming you carry forbidden magic," Nora said, her voice trembling with barely contained fear. "She's brought a representative from the southern territories to witness the proceedings, someone with authority to challenge the crown's judgment if the council finds the accusations credible." Elira did not wait to hear more. She rushed from her room, moving quickly through the palace corridors toward the council chamber, her mind racing through every possible outcome, none of them favorable. She found Cassian already standing at the head of the council table when she arrived, his expression a carefully controlled mask of fury barely restrained beneath the surface. Ophelia stood near the center of the room, composed and confident, gesturing toward a tall, severe-looking man Elira did not recognize, standing near the chamber's entrance with an expression of cold calculation. "Your Majesty," Ophelia said smoothly, as Elira entered, her pale eyes flickering toward the doorway, with barely concealed triumph. "How convenient. Perhaps the healer herself can answer the council's questions directly." Every eye in the chamber turned toward Elira, and she felt the full weight of the moment pressing down on her chest like a physical force. Months of careful concealment, months of quiet hope, all collapsing in a single, devastating instant. "What is this?" Elira asked, forcing steadiness into her voice, despite the fear coursing through her. "I've brought evidence before this council," Ophelia said, her voice carrying easily through the silent chamber, "that you, Elira Voss, carry blood from the moonless line, a bloodline this crown's own ancestors deemed too dangerous to allow to survive. I've also brought a witness, a young guard treated in this very palace, who can testify to abilities far beyond ordinary medicine." Elira's stomach dropped. The young guard, sworn to secrecy after the training accident months earlier, had somehow been found and pressured into speaking, either through coercion or manipulation, Elira could not yet determine. "This is a serious accusation," said one of the older council members, his expression grave. "If true, it represents a direct violation of ancient law, law established by King Cassian's own grandfather. "It is true," Elira said, before Cassian could speak, before anyone else could shape the narrative for her. Every head in the chamber turned toward her in stunned silence. "I do carry blood from the moonless line. And yes, I possess the healing gift associated with that bloodline." Gasps rippled through the council chamber, but Elira continued, her voice growing steadier with each word, drawing strength from a well of resolve she had not fully known she possessed until this exact moment. "But I have never once used that gift to harm anyone," she continued. "I have used it only to heal, to save a guard's life when ordinary medicine would have failed him, to ease suffering wherever I found it, quietly and without seeking recognition or reward. If the law this council speaks of was designed to protect this kingdom from danger, then I ask you to look at what I have actually done with the gift I carry, rather than simply the fear surrounding its history." The chamber fell into tense, uncertain silence. Elira could see doubt flickering across some of the council members' faces, uncertainty warring with the deeply ingrained fear that generations of history had instilled regarding her bloodline. Ophelia, sensing the moment slipping slightly from her control, pressed forward quickly. "Regardless of her intentions, the law is clear. The bloodline must be reported, investigated, and judged according to ancient precedent, not simply excused because the king has taken a personal interest in her. The law also grants the reigning king final authority over matters of ancient precedent," Cassian said, his voice cutting through the tension with absolute, unshakable command. "And as the current king, I am exercising that authority now." He stepped forward, moving to stand directly beside Elira, close enough that their shoulders nearly touched, a clear and unmistakable declaration to every person in the chamber. "I have known the truth of Elira Voss's bloodline for months," he said, his eyes sweeping across the assembled council with fierce, unwavering resolve. "I chose not to report it, not out of foolishness or blind affection, but because I judged, with careful consideration, that the danger this council fears does not exist within her. She is not a threat to this kingdom. She is, in fact, exactly the kind of person this kingdom needs more of, someone who chooses compassion and healing, even when the world has given her every reason to choose fear and isolation instead." He turned to face the southern representative standing near the doorway, his expression hardening further. "And to whoever sent you here tonight, hoping to use ancient prejudice as a weapon against my crown, know this: I will not be manipulated by fear disguised as law. Any further attempt to threaten Elira Voss will be treated as a direct threat against the crown itself, and answered accordingly." The chamber remained silent for a long, tense moment, the weight of Cassian's declaration settling heavily over every person present. Finally, the eldest council member spoke, his voice careful but no longer hostile. "Your Majesty, if the council is to accept your judgment on this matter, we would ask for time to review the ancient law more carefully, to determine whether an exception can be properly established." "You have until dawn," Cassian said firmly. "I will not have Elira's safety left uncertain any longer than necessary." As the council began filing out of the chamber, murmuring quietly among themselves, Ophelia lingered near the doorway, her expression tight with barely restrained frustration at having her plans so thoroughly disrupted. Her eyes met Elira's briefly across the room, cold and calculating, before she too finally turned and disappeared into the corridor beyond. Elira felt her legs weaken beneath her the moment the chamber had fully emptied, the adrenaline that had carried her through the confrontation finally beginning to fade. Cassian caught her gently before she could stumble, wrapping his arms firmly around her. "You were incredible," he murmured against her hair. "Braver than I've seen anyone be in that chamber in years." "I was terrified," Elira admitted, her voice shaking now that the immediate danger had passed. "You didn't show it," Cassian said. "Not once." Despite the temporary reprieve the council had granted, Elira understood clearly that the danger surrounding her secret had not disappeared. Ophelia remained a threat. The southern representative would surely report tonight's events back to Roland Ashworth, and the ancient law hanging over her bloodline still required a formal resolution before dawn. But standing there in Cassian's arms, having finally spoken her truth openly before the entire council, rather than continuing to hide it in fearful silence, Elira felt something shift permanently within her, a weight lifted that she had carried for far longer than she had ever fully realized. "The winter moon reaches its peak in less than 3 hours," Cassian said quietly, still holding her close. Whatever the council decides by dawn, I still intend to complete the ritual tonight, if you're still willing. Illyra looked up at him, exhaustion and fear still coursing through her, but beneath it, something steadier and more certain than she had ever felt before. I'm willing, she said, more certain now than I've ever been. Together, they left the council chamber behind, moving quickly through the quiet, moonlit corridors of the palace, toward the private preparations still waiting to be completed before the winter moon reached its full and final peak. The private chamber Cassian had chosen for the ritual sat at the highest point of the palace's northern tower, a round stone room with a wide-open ceiling that allowed the full light of the winter moon to pour directly down onto the floor below. The head physician had prepared everything carefully in the hours before, arranging candles in a wide circle around a simple woven mat at the center of the room, along with a small collection of herbs Illyra had selected specifically for their significance to her bloodline's ancient practices. Illyra stood at the center of the circle, her hands trembling slightly, though whether from the cold winter air or the enormity of what was about to happen, she could not fully determine. Cassian entered the chamber a few moments later, having changed from his formal council attire into simple, unadorned clothing, his expression calm despite the tension still lingering from the confrontation only hours earlier. The council sent word, he said quietly, closing the heavy wooden door behind him. They've agreed to review the ancient law with the intention of establishing a formal exception, given the evidence presented tonight of your character and the harmless nature of your gift. It's not finalized, but it's a strong indication of where their judgment will land by dawn. Relief flooded through Illyra, though it did little to ease the anxious anticipation building steadily in her chest as the moment of the ritual drew closer. That's good news. It is, Cassian agreed, crossing the room to stand beside her within the candlelit circle. But right now, none of that matters as much as this. He took both her hands gently in his storm-gray eyes steady and full of quiet devotion. Are you certain, Illyra? Once this begins, there's no undoing it. The bond will be complete, permanent, exactly the thing you once begged me not to force upon you. Illyra looked up at him, searching her own heart one final time for any remaining trace of the fear that had governed her decisions for so many years. She found instead something steadier, something that had grown slowly and carefully over the past 3 months, until it had quietly replaced the fear entirely. I'm certain, she said, her voice clear and unwavering in the quiet chamber. I'm not choosing this out of desperation to save my mother, though I hope with everything in me that it will. I'm choosing this because somewhere over these past months, without fully realizing it was happening, I fell completely in love with you, Cassian Thorne. Not the king, the man who waited 3 years without demanding anything in return, the man who chose patience over power, and trust over fear. Cassian's breath caught, emotion flooding openly across his usually composed features. I love you, he said simply, the words carrying the full weight of 3 years of searching and 3 months of careful, patient devotion. I have loved you since before I ever properly knew your name. The head physician, who had remained quietly near the chamber entrance, stepped forward now to guide them through the final steps of the ancient ritual. Under the direct light of the full winter moon, Illyra and Cassian knelt together at the center of the circle, their joined hands resting over a small silver bowl containing a mixture of herbs Illyra had carefully selected and prepared over the preceding days. The physician spoke the ancient words in a low, steady voice, words drawn directly from the archive scroll Illyra and Cassian had discovered months earlier, calling upon the moon's ancient authority to witness and bind the fated connection between them fully and completely. As the final words were spoken, Cassian lowered his head to the curve of Illyra's neck, his breath warm against her skin, and completed the claim that had waited 3 long years to be fulfilled. A warmth unlike anything Illyra had ever experienced spread instantly through her entire body, golden and radiant, the same familiar sensation of her healing gift, but magnified beyond anything she had ever accessed on her own. She felt the bond settle fully into place, an unbreakable thread connecting her heart directly to Cassian's, carrying with it not only his love, but a surge of strength that seemed to flow directly from him into her, exactly as the ancient text had described. When the ritual finally concluded, both of them breathless and radiant with the completed bond now humming steadily between them, the head physician offered a rare, genuine smile. "It is done," he said quietly. "The bond is complete, and if the ancient text is accurate, the exchange of strength should already be working to counter the exhaustion in your bloodline." Elira felt it immediately, a subtle but unmistakable shift within her own body. The familiar undercurrent of weariness she had carried her entire life, inherited quietly from generations of overused gift, beginning to ease for the first time she could remember. She looked up at Cassian, tears gathering unexpectedly in her eyes. "I can feel it," she whispered. "The exhaustion, it's lifting." "Then we send word to your mother's healer immediately," Cassian said, already moving toward the door, urgency and excitement mixing in his voice. "If the ritual has strengthened your own bloodline's resilience, it may be able to reach her as well, through the connection you share." A messenger was dispatched before dawn, carrying urgent instructions to the healer, stationed at Elira's mother's cottage, along with a detailed description of the ritual's completion, and the hope that its effects might extend protectively to other members of the bloodline, connected through Elira's own restored strength. The following days passed in a blur of anxious waiting, mixed with the quiet, steady joy of the completed bond, settling naturally into place between Elira and Cassian. The council, true to their word, formally established an exception within the ancient law by the following evening, recognizing Elira's bloodline as protected under the crown's direct authority, effectively ending any legal threat Ophelia's accusations might have once carried. Ophelia herself had disappeared from the palace entirely, following the council session, her absence noted with quiet suspicion by the guards Cassian assigned to investigate her sudden departure. Reports eventually confirmed that she had fled south, toward the territory controlled by Roland Ashworth, seeking refuge with the very ally she had hoped to use against the crown. Cassian, though frustrated by her escape, made the decision not to pursue immediate retaliation, focusing instead on the more pressing concern of Elira's mother's health and the delicate process of formally establishing Elira's new position within the court. It was nearly a week after the ritual's completion when the messenger finally returned from Elira's mother's cottage, carrying news that brought Elira to tears of relief the moment she read it. Her mother's condition had improved dramatically in the days following the ritual, the persistent weakness that had plagued her for months finally beginning to fade, replaced by a steadily returning strength that the attending healer described as nothing short of remarkable. "She's recovering," Elira said, reading the letter aloud to Cassian in their private chambers, her voice thick with emotion. "The healer says if the improvement continues at this pace, she could be fully well within the month." Cassian pulled her gently into his arms, sharing fully in her relief and joy. "I told you I would help however I could," he murmured against her hair. "I'm only grateful the ritual worked exactly as we hoped." As winter began its slow transition toward the first hints of early spring, Elira found herself settling more fully into her new life within the palace, no longer as a hidden secret carefully concealed from prying eyes, but as an openly claimed and deeply loved partner to the king himself. The infirmary staff, who had grown genuinely fond of her over the preceding months, celebrated the news of her official position with warm, unguarded joy. Even the more cautious members of the council, initially hesitant about the unprecedented nature of her claiming, gradually came to respect the quiet strength and genuine compassion she brought to her role within the court. But even as the immediate danger from Ophelia's accusations faded into the background, Elira understood that the threat had not entirely disappeared. Somewhere in the southern territories, Ophelia remained, allied now with a pack leader who had long harbored resentment toward the Thorn Crown, and the possibility remained that the conflict between them was far from truly finished. For now, though, standing beside Cassian in the quiet, peaceful days following the ritual's success, watching the first signs of spring slowly begin to emerge across the palace gardens, Elira allowed herself, finally and completely, to simply be happy. The years of hiding, of fear, of carefully guarding every part of herself from a world she believed would only ever see her as dangerous, had finally given way to something she had never truly believed she would be allowed to have. She had been seen, fully and completely, by someone who chose to love every part of what he found, rather than fear it. And for the first time in her entire life, Elira Voss finally felt, without hesitation or doubt, that she truly belonged exactly where she stood. Spring arrived in full across the kingdom, transforming the palace grounds into a vibrant display of blooming flowers and fresh green leaves. But the peace Elira had come to treasure was destined not to last uninterrupted. Nearly 2 months after the ritual's completion, word reached the palace that Roland Ashworth had begun openly gathering forces along the southern border, using Ophelia's accusations as public justification for what he claimed was a necessary intervention against a crown that had abandoned ancient law in favor of personal desire. Cassian called an urgent council meeting the moment the reports were confirmed, and Alira, now formally recognized as his claimed mate, sat beside him at the council table for the first time, no longer an outsider forced to defend herself, but a full participant in the decisions shaping the kingdom's response. Ashworth has never forgiven the loss of the border territory, Cassian explained, spreading a detailed map across the table. He's been searching for justification to challenge the crown for years. Ophelia has simply given him the excuse he's been waiting for. How large is his gathered force? Asked one of the council members, concern etched across his weathered face. Significant, Cassian admitted. Large enough that a direct confrontation would be costly for both sides, but not so large that negotiation is entirely out of the question, if we can find the right approach. Alira listened carefully to the discussion unfolding around her, her mind working through the problem with the same careful, analytical attention she had always applied to diagnosing difficult illnesses. What if the approach isn't military at all? She said finally, drawing surprised glances from several council members, unaccustomed to her voice carrying weight in matters of this nature. Go on, Cassian encouraged, his eyes warm with genuine interest rather than dismissal. Ashworth's justification relies entirely on the claim that this crown has abandoned ancient law, Alira continued. But the council itself formally reviewed that law and established a legitimate exception, based on evidence and careful consideration, not simply royal whim. If we can present that process clearly and publicly, through proper diplomatic channels, we remove the foundation of his justification entirely. He would be forced to either accept the council's ruling as legitimate, or reveal that his true motivation has nothing to do with ancient law at all, and everything to do with old resentment over territory he lost fairly, years ago. The council chamber fell into thoughtful silence as her suggestions settled over the assembled members. The eldest council member, who had initially been among the most skeptical of Alira's presence within the court, finally spoke, a note of genuine respect coloring his voice. A wise approach, he said. Diplomacy backed by legitimate legal process would strip Ashworth of his public justification far more effectively than any show of force. Cassian smiled at Alira with unmistakable pride. Then we'll send a formal delegation, carrying the council's full documented ruling, along with an invitation for Ashworth to present any remaining grievances through proper diplomatic channels, rather than through open aggression. The delegation departed within days, carrying carefully prepared documentation of the council's legal review, alongside a formal, dignified invitation for peaceful negotiation. The following weeks passed in tense anticipation, as the kingdom awaited Ashworth's response, uncertain whether diplomacy would prove sufficient to diffuse the growing tension along the southern border. During this anxious waiting period, Alira received word that her mother, now fully recovered from the illness that had plagued her for so long, wished to travel to the palace to see her daughter's new life for herself. The reunion, when it finally arrived, brought Alira to tears the moment she saw her mother step down from the carriage, standing tall and strong, in a way Alira had feared she might never witness again.
"Look at you," her mother said, embracing her tightly, tears of her own gathering in her eyes. "My clever, brave girl. A queen."
Not yet officially, Alira laughed, though happiness radiated from every part of her, but close enough. Cassian greeted Alira's mother with warm, genuine respect, and the following days brought a quiet joy to the palace that Alira had never dared imagine possible during her years of careful hiding. Watching her mother walk freely through the palace gardens, healthy and strong, sharing easy conversation with the man Alira had come to love so completely, felt like a dream she was almost afraid might disappear if she looked at it too closely. The response from Roland Ashworth finally arrived nearly 3 weeks after the delegation's departure, and to the relief of the entire council, it carried an offer of peaceful negotiation, rather than continued aggression. Faced with the undeniable legitimacy of the council's documented ruling, and unwilling to risk open conflict without the moral justification he had originally claimed, Ashworth agreed to a formal meeting to discuss his grievances through proper channels. The negotiations, held over the course of several tense but ultimately productive days, revealed exactly what Alira had suspected from the beginning. Ashworth's true grievance had little to do with ancient law regarding forbidden bloodlines, and everything to do with lingering resentment over territory lost years before Cassian's reign had even begun. Stripped of Ophelia's manufactured justification, his position weakened considerably, and the negotiations ultimately concluded with a renewed peace agreement, along with minor concessions regarding trade rights that satisfied Ashworth's pride without compromising the crown's authority. Ophelia herself, having lost the support of her southern ally the moment his justification collapsed, disappeared entirely from any known territory, her fate afterward remaining largely unknown, though Cassian's guards continued to monitor for any sign of her resurfacing to cause further trouble. With the southern threat finally resolved and peace restored along the kingdom's borders, Cassian turned his attention toward a celebration that had been quietly delayed since the completion of the winter ritual months earlier, the formal coronation that would recognize Alira not simply as his claimed mate, but as the queen of the entire kingdom. The preparations for the coronation transformed the palace over the following weeks into a place of vibrant activity, far removed from the quiet, tense atmosphere that had defined so much of the previous winter. Alira found herself swept into fittings for elaborate ceremonial robes, discussions with the palace stewards about the proper order of proceedings, and countless small decisions that felt, at times, overwhelming for someone who had spent most of her life trying to avoid drawing any attention at all. "You look nervous," Cassian observed one evening, finding her standing quietly in front of a tall mirror in her chambers, studying the deep blue coronation robes still being finalized by the palace tailors. "I've spent my whole life trying not to be seen," Alira admitted, meeting his eyes in the mirror's reflection. "Now I'm about to stand in front of the entire kingdom, in the most visible role imaginable." Cassian crossed the room and stood behind her, resting his hands gently on her shoulders. "You face down an entire council chamber, armed with nothing but the truth," he reminded her softly. "You've already proven you can stand in the light without breaking. This is simply the next step of a journey you've already been walking for months." His words settled the anxious flutter in her chest, and Alira found herself smiling at her own reflection, seeing not the frightened girl who had once begged a king not to claim her, but someone steadier, someone who had learned, slowly and carefully, that being seen did not have to mean being destroyed. The infirmary staff, who had grown to consider Alira something between a colleague and a friend over the preceding months, insisted on personally overseeing the preparation of a small gift for the coronation, a beautifully bound book documenting the healing techniques Alira had shared with them throughout her time working alongside them, a permanent record of the knowledge she had brought openly into their practice. "We wanted you to know," Nora said, presenting the book with unmistakable warmth, "that no matter what title you carry after tomorrow, you'll always be the healer who taught us new ways to save our patients. That matters just as much as any crown." Alira accepted the gift, with tears gathering in her eyes, deeply moved by the genuine affection behind it. The months she had spent working quietly in the infirmary, treating every patient with the same careful attention regardless of their status, had built connections and respect that no crown could have manufactured on its own, connections that meant more to her than she had fully realized until this exact moment. The morning of the coronation arrived clear and bright, the kind of early spring day that seemed to carry the promise of renewal in every gentle breeze. The great hall, the same enormous space where Alira had once stood terrified during the presentation, now overflowed with color and celebration. Banners bearing not only the traditional thorn crest but a new addition, a small silver wolf surrounded by healing herbs, representing the union between the crown and the once forbidden bloodline it had finally chosen to embrace rather than fear. Alira walked down the long aisle toward the throne, her deep blue robes catching the light streaming through the tall windows, her mother watching proudly from the front row alongside Nora and the other infirmary staff who had become such an important part of her new life. The court that had once whispered in scandalized confusion at her refusal now watched with genuine warmth and respect, the months since the presentation having slowly transformed suspicion into acceptance, and acceptance into something approaching admiration. Cassian stood waiting at the top of the dais, dressed in formal ceremonial attire, his storm-gray eyes finding hers the moment she entered the hall, exactly as they had on that first fateful night, nearly 6 months earlier. But where his gaze had once carried desperate, searching recognition, it now carried something steadier and more complete, the quiet certainty of a bond fully realized and openly celebrated. The head physician, who had guided them through the winter ritual months earlier, presided over the formal coronation ceremony, his voice carrying clearly through the silent hall as he spoke the traditional words binding Illyra's new title to the crown. When the moment finally arrived for Cassian to place the ceremonial crown upon her head, a delicate silver piece, woven with small healing herbs, to honor her bloodline's true nature, the entire hall erupted into genuine, enthusiastic celebration. "Queen Illyra Thorne," Cassian announced, his voice carrying across the hall with unmistakable pride, "protector of the healing bloodline, and the truest partner this crown has ever known." The celebration that followed lasted long into the evening, filling the palace with music and laughter that felt like a direct answer to the tense, fearful silence that had once defined Illyra's first night within these walls. She danced with Cassian beneath the great hall's high ceiling, surrounded by the same court that had once watched her refusal with scandalized whispers, now celebrating her coronation with genuine warmth and respect. Later that evening, as the celebration finally began to quiet and guests slowly departed toward their own chambers, Illyra and Cassian found a quiet moment alone, on the same balcony, overlooking the gardens where they had first begun to truly know one another months earlier. The night air carried the sweet scent of blooming spring flowers, and above them, the stars stretched out in a clear, endless sky. 3 years I searched for you," Cassian said softly, pulling her gently against his side as they looked out over the moonlit gardens. "And I would have waited 300 more, if that's what it took." "I'm glad you didn't have to," Illyra said, resting her head against his shoulder, the weight of years spent hiding finally, completely lifted from her heart. "Any regrets?" he asked, only half teasing. "About everything that led us here?" Illyra considered the question seriously, thinking back over the terrified girl who had begged the king not to claim her, the months of careful hiding, the confrontation in the council chamber, the winter ritual that had saved her mother's life and bound her fate irrevocably to his. Every difficult, frightening moment had led, step by careful step, to exactly this quiet, peaceful joy she now held so completely. "None," she said finally, and meant it with her whole heart. "Every part of this journey brought me exactly where I was always meant to be." Below them, the palace gardens rested peacefully beneath the starlit sky, the same gardens where a healer's daughter and a waiting king had slowly, carefully built a bond, stronger than any fear or danger that had tried to stand against it. The kingdom that once feared the moonless bloodline now celebrated its queen openly, and the crown that had once hunted her ancestors now stood proudly beside her, protecting rather than threatening the gift she carried. Illyra Voss, once a girl who had spent her entire life trying to remain unseen, now stood fully known and fully loved beside the king who had waited 3 years to find her, and 3 months more to earn the trust that finally let her stop running. Whatever challenges the future held, she understood now, standing beneath that clear spring sky, with Cassian's steady presence beside her, that she would never again have to face them alone. The story of the healer who refused a crown, only to be won not through demand, but through patience, had already begun spreading quietly through the kingdom's villages and packs, told and retold, as a reminder that even the most powerful among them could learn the value of waiting for something worth having. And in the quiet corners of taverns and around evening fires, parents would tell their children of the Alpha King, who found his fated mate not through force, but through 3 years of searching, and a promise to wait as long as it took. A story that would be remembered, long after that first presentation night, as the beginning of the truest reign the kingdom had ever known.